what do you see as sort of the landscape as we start 2026? And maybe you could sort of paint a broad picture for a moment in terms of what's happening on the model development side and the capabilities to come, and then we can talk more a bit about what you and I talk often about, which is enterprise adoption and what that looks like. But I want to give you an opportunity to maybe just paint a picture of the landscape as we start this calendar year.
I mean, on the model side, in general, we see significant progress every 6 months or so with a new set of skills being added to the model. And as the skills get added to the model, you can apply it to new domains. Early on, a lot of the capability of the model was on teaching the model to understand and analyze information. And the models got richer in terms of the types of information they could understand and how much they could retain in their memory. So when you asked it more questions, it could reason on larger and larger volumes of information. And so on that dimension, we've seen things now where we just announced something yesterday called personal intelligence, where as a consumer, as you use it, it can remember what you're looking for. And so as you search for things over time, it gets much, much more specific in its ability to find things that matter to you. And that's partly because it can remember. It has a new technique to essentially do infinite memory. The other skill, the other dimension on which we work on is new types of reasoning. So for example, you can, when you apply it in a medical field, for example, and if you're using it to understand guidelines, you can teach it to only pay attention to the information published by the medical standards bodies and not to look at anything else. Mm-hmm. So that's a unique kind of information. We're teaching it to do planning. Planning is to take a high-level task and then to break it into a set of subtasks, but to know the sequencing of these tasks. So for example, if you tell it to book a travel journey for you, needing to know what's the first thing it needs to do, and that it has to book a flight before it books a hotel room in a destination. For complex projects, that becomes very important, that skill. We're also teaching it to learn to use tools so that in an enterprise context, you don't have to rewrite all the tools you have, but the model knows how to use a tool. So for example, if you're doing supply planning, it can look at your inventory management tools and use them to reason on, do you have sufficient inventory to meet new demand, for example. And so we're constantly evolving these. A new area we're working on is teaching the model to look at information that it has never seen before. Because people have asked us a lot on what happens if it sees information it hasn't been trained on. And so we are teaching the model now how to reason on things that it may never have seen before. And that's an important dimension because there's always been anxiety on if it's trained on most of the information on the internet, will it get materially better in the future, or are you going to see diminishing returns? And that a lot of it comes down to you don't need the same amount of data to teach it new skills. So these are some of the dimensions on which we work.
So it feels like the rate of innovation of the new skills and new capabilities is only going to continue to intensify. Right. So if you pivot then to the enterprise and the challenge of adoption, the challenge of looking for use cases that really create business value, how are you talking to enterprise clients about how to do that, how to have the capability to assimilate these incredible pace of innovation of the tools and capabilities themselves?
I think over the last year, we've seen people focus from, 2 years ago, people were like, I'm going to let 1,000 flowers bloom and see which of these projects get successful. I think over the last year and a half, we've seen it consolidate around three big domains. One is 3 or 4 big domains. One is changing the kind of products you're building and the use of AI to transform the products themselves. The second is how you engage and serve your customers or citizens or patients if you're in hospital. And third, transforming the core of the company, meaning the core processes. And these are different in different industries. So for example, if you look at healthcare, just as an example, where people using our models to actually change the way they design new molecules, the way they do research on new therapies, for example, and that's on the product side. Then we have people who are changing and using our systems for clinical appointment scheduling, tertiary care or ambulatory care, which is you go to a facility, you're diagnosed with a disease, then you go back home and you have follow-up questions, or you need ambulatory care where the nurse comes to your facility, and we equip them with tools to help take that information with them and answer questions. And then in the core of the companies, whether that's managing fraud in financial services, streamlining settlement in capital markets. In healthcare, for example, 51,000 oncologists in the United States are using Gemini to understand standard of care guidelines. And because those guidelines change, and in many cases, they also conflict. Like, this is a guideline, but if the person also has this disease, don't prescribe this. And so there's a lot of things now happening in the core of the company, in the core of these organizations as they use AI to advance how they're working. In technology, largely our focus has been in IT departments around improving software engineering skills, improving the way that people understand and search and find information in companies. And then lastly, we are bringing significant new advances in our cyber tools because to protect against AI threats, we've seen now the emergence of new threats where models are being used to create threats. And to protect against those, you need to also advance the way that you defend against them. So there's advances there too.
So your advice to enterprises is that these three broad categories of your product and how you innovate the product, how you innovate around the customer, how you innovate around the core.
Yes.
That's right. The Google Cloud House view of where you should be focused, because it feels like, well, that's a lot of the ground to cover, but that's where there's business value and impact to be had.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. And what is the types of business impact that you've seen already in your customers that gives you confidence that there's even greater business impact to come? I mean, you mentioned a few industry verticals where you're seeing, tremendous result. Is there a few that really come to mind that you think are indicative of what could be, broadly available to all enterprises?
A lot of our, we generally talk to our clients about picking and choosing how they want to measure the business outcome. So if you look at product, a lot of people are looking at, can they improve the velocity of new product, and can they also improve the capability of the product after it has been delivered? So for example, a mechanical product often has a certain boundary when it's manufactured. If you add software to it, you can update the software and enhance its capability a long time after it is shipped. And so we've done a lot of work with automotive and other manufacturing industries to improve the capability of those products after they've been shipped. Because you can enhance the way that driving works, you can enhance the way that the car coordinates with the rest of the person's environment, and there's a lot of advances happening in that domain. And so that comes down to, how do you want to differentiate your product? Do you want to change the product from being a one-time product that's purchased to more of a subscription-like product that has capability that lasts beyond the dimension when you bought it? On customer, a lot of it is around one of three dimensions. One is, can you free up your people to do other things? So for example, if you look at hospitals, typically they're short of nurses. Nurses, and the reason nurses are important is hospital profitability is heavily driven by how many beds you have, and beds are proportionate to how many nurses you have. And so a lot of times nurses spend their time writing, transcribing information. And we've done some projects to help live hand off from one nurse to the next. So they don't have to waste their time writing. The model writes their instructions and they can remain by the patient bedside. That improves both the perception of care, but also the efficiency and productivity of people. We've seen things, for example, where you can have insurance claims, for example. We've automated automotive claims in many, many countries, where if you're in an accident, you take a picture of the car, our model assesses the damage and debits the bank account, which hugely improves the perception of how quickly your claim is being processed. And it's not just about reducing the cost of processing the claim, but the customer satisfaction perception. Within the organization, inside the core, it could be one of three dimensions people are looking at. One could be, am I changing my core to be more efficient? So for example, we've done work in mortgage lending, credit card issuance, where you submit a form as a consumer applying for a mortgage. Our computers read the form and turn around lending, and it's an order of magnitude. It takes it down from weeks to a matter of 3, 4, 5 minutes. And so that's a competitive advantage for an issuer. So one could be streamlining a process. Two could be offsetting cost. And so in supply planning, for example, based on all the changes with tariff rates, for example, there's a lot of organizations using a model to reason on what's the best way to route components around the world so that you can manage logistics and tariff rates by optimizing where you ship and from. And two, because that has a big impact on how many times something crosses the border, which affects how much tariff you're paying. That's an example. And then there are many organizations in service-oriented industries. One of the firms we work with is Fresh Fields, which is the firm that works with us on legal. And because they do a lot of time-based billing, and as AI changes the notion of time, they're changing the business model with us as well. So there's a lot of this happening.
It's interesting listening to you speak. I mean, it almost as if the rate limiting issue is being able to conceptualize these AI native processes very differently.
That's right.
That's right. To really rethink what can look like in terms of the claims process you described or patient care processes. That's not a capability a lot of enterprises have, and it's an area where Deloitte works with clients too. But it strikes me that that's the real stretch for enterprises.
That's right.
Yeah. Thomas, maybe you could talk a little bit about what's to come. Like what other areas in the Google Cloud sort of innovation product realm should we expect to hear about in the year to come? I know the data center space is an area of interest, and obviously the importance of compute. But maybe you can highlight any other areas in the Google Cloud portfolio that are important for us to watch and understand.
I mean, we're bringing a lot of the advances we're making with the models through tools and platforms to people. So we've developed something that's one of our fastest growing lines, which is to take Gemini, which is our model, and hook it up to all the enterprise tools that people are using, your collaboration tools, your ERP and other systems, so that you can use it at large scale. And many people are now evaluating it for many different domains. And so an example we have is people using it to optimize the way that they close the loop on the customer side, which is, I want to create content, I want to post it on different digital media, I want to measure conversion rate, and I want to close the loop. In that area, for example, because the models are so efficient in understanding, we have worked with a number of apparel and leisure and other clothing companies to build. One company built an advertising campaign based on over 100 dimensions because it's a shoe company. And shoes, you can think of it by age of the person, affluence, sport, athlete they follow. There are many, many dimensions. And often traditional marketing campaigns don't take all those dimensions into consideration when you're creating the content because it's expensive to create content. Now, because the models make content creation much cheaper, you can actually be much, much more cost effective in creating many variants. And that in turn drives very high conversion rates. So one is, we call that essentially enterprise intelligence, which is understanding your information much more deeply and being, whether it's using it for planning or internal purposes or using it to serve customers better, you can be incredibly much more accurate in doing that. We're also introducing planning tools, and planning tools is something we've been working on for a while, and that can be applied to many, many different domains within a company and also in serving clients. So an example is in financial services, people were initially using our models for research. So they would use it to research. A very simple example is many capital markets firms are using a model to take all the information published at the end of the day on financial statements, like your 10K, 10Q, and earnings statements, summarize it, and give it to the investment professionals. And the reason is that their high net worth clients typically used to call their investment professionals saying, I watched this earnings announcement, how does it affect my portfolio? And they said, can we be proactive in arming our people with that? Now the next step that they're working on is to allow these models to be used to understand a consumer's financial needs and to build a financial plan. And so it's essentially asking you to say, I have 2 kids, they're going to college, here's my cash flow need and how that'll change, and then I'm planning to do X or Y. And the model can take that and deconstruct it into a plan and then help build something and assist the investment professional in answering those questions. So these are examples of new things that we'll be introducing so that people, and so we still look at it as at the foundational level, what do we do with the skills of the model? And then how do we expose it through a set of tools that connect that model to everything that exists within a company so they can then use it to serve differently and better.
Yeah, I think that nomenclature around the skills of the model is something that enterprises have to internalize. What is your advice? Just I want to probe on a different aspect of the guardrails that organizations need to have in place to understand how the models are being used, what data is being ingested, what human in the loop means from the standpoint of accountability. How does Google Cloud think about that? What is your advice to enterprise clients who are wrestling with that issue?
In general, I think, we always say to use AI well, you need a strong foundational element. I would say there are 4 typical boundaries on that. One is identity and access control, which is knowing what users are permitted to access. And there are techniques to ensure that when they're using the models to do tasks, they're not bypassing all the controls you had. So a person cannot see information they're not authorized to see based on their role. And there's techniques to doing that so that you can ensure only people are authorized to see information they were authorized to see. The second, I think, is audit trail. So for example, if a model is being used to automate an entire workflow where it takes information, processes it, and then takes action on different systems, for example, to approve something in a system, you have audit trail, and you need to make sure that you are comfortable with the granularity of that audit trail for compliance reporting. And there are various controls in the model to ensure, for example, that you can ensure a model doesn't do something like have the model give yourself a raise. We've seen people try to do that, and there's controls in the system to protect against that, but that's an auditing requirement that people have. The third one is how to test the quality of the model. So a very basic example is if you're asking a model to reason on a set of information, how do you ensure that the output it's giving you meets your quality standard? And a very simple example is in software engineering, people ask us all the time, what happens if the model generates code that's got a bug in it? How do you ensure that you can have a check on it and not have a check just with humans, but also have a check with model control? And so there are techniques now that we've introduced where you can ask the model to do self-reflection and like evaluate its own answers. And there's various other techniques to protect against that. That's another example of something they've introduced. And then the last one is there are places where you need to use the model either with human control because of regulatory or other things, or with other controls. So I'll give you two examples. In financial services, because of equal opportunity lending and other things, if you're issuing a mortgage, you need the model to be 100% consistent. Meaning if you put the same information about a person 100,000 times, the model has to say yes or no consistently 100,000 times. These large language models are not designed to be exactly reproducing that, but they have the ability to generate code, and code behaves the same way every time. And so there's techniques where if you're running a regulatory process or, for example, supply planning, hey, I need to know exactly what the model will do every time, and I can't have it have any judgment. There's one way is to introduce a different technique in how the model does something. Another way is to introduce a human in the loop. So, for example, on medical, we have never allowed a model to give advice to people. We always have a human, like a nurse or a doctor, in the loop, partly because models don't do physical exams. You still need to actually see what's wrong with the patient. And the model can, for example, do things like, if the patient has this, it's potentially, as a doctor, you need to look here, but it's still the doctor's judgment. And so there are places where we provide mechanisms to always have human control over the model's execution. And so we've constantly teach people how to do it, and the tools provide the facilities to do all this, but people are still learning to do it. And it's interesting observing how newer people in the workforce versus people who have been in the workforce for a long time approach these things. If you look at our software engineers, for example, the more senior people use the tool in very specific places. Our most senior people actually write the most elegant code, because a senior person can write in 5 lines what a junior person may take 1,000 lines to say, but they use it for tasks that they don't like to do. For example, write documentation, improve quality assurance. The more junior people, we see now that they may have 4 windows open at the same time. One is the coding window in which they're having the model assist them by writing code, but they also do a lot of tasks asynchronously. They have another window open where the model is compiling the code, another window where it's running all the security scans, because we have taught the model to scan code for security vulnerabilities. And so they're essentially doing massive multitasking using the model to do other steps, which improves their efficiency in many different ways. And so we also tell people to learn by observing what the people themselves are doing. And we notice definitely a difference between newer people entering the workforce for whom these tools are almost second nature versus people who have been around for a while.
So Thomas, I know we have to let you go, but if you think about 2026, I've heard some discussion here in Davos already about this being the year where AGI is declared. Is that an important question? Is that relevant in your view? Is that something that we're going to just keep moving on this innovation curve no matter what? Or is that a significant milestone?
At least at Google, we don't spend a lot of time debating what is AGI and whether it's happening this year or next year. I mean, we're constantly looking at, can we improve the capabilities of the tools and models we're making available? And we see a lot of crossover between what people experience with our models in the consumer world and how they use it at their company. And so a lot of that we see translating, but we don't spend a ton of time debating what is AGI and when is it happening. We're not focused on a singularity like that.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
having me.